The dust inside the Millfield Bank tasted of failure. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated the tongue and settled in the lungs, a constant reminder of the drought that was strangling the territory. Jasper stood at the teller's window, his hat held in his hands, the cracked leather a testament to years of hard labor that had amounted to nothing. The air was thick with the smell of old paper-stale ink and the quiet desperation of men like him, men who had bet everything on a patch of unforgiving land. Then the world exploded. The heavy oak door slammed open with a force that rattled the windows in their frames. A man stood silhouetted against the blinding glare of the midday sun, a figure of pure menace wrapped in a long dark duster. His face was obscured by a dusty bandana, but his eyes, two chips of cold blue ice, swept the room with an unnerving calm. He held a Colt revolver in a hand that was steady, almost elegant. Panic erupted. A woman shrieked. The bank manager, a portly man named Henderson, dropped a stack of ledgers with a loud thud. The chaos was a wave, and Jasper, rooted to the spot, was an island in its path. On the floor, the robber's voice was not a shout, but a low, controlled command that cut through the noise with surgical precision. It was educated, almost refined, lacking the rough growl of a common highwayman. People scrambled their boots, scraping against the wooden floorboards. Jasper, however, remained standing, his mind struggling to process the intrusion. The robber's gaze flicked to him, a flicker of annoyance in those cold eyes. I sat on the floor. Jasper's knees bent slowly, his body obeying before his mind could. He knelt, his eyes still fixed on the man. Something was wrong. This wasn't just about money. The robber moved with a predator's grace, ignoring the customers cowering on the floor. He vaulted over the teller's counter landing as lightly as a cat. The young teller, a boy named Charlie, with more fear than sense, fumbled with the cash drawer. "Not that you fool," the robber hissed, shoving Charlie aside. The boy stumbled, crashing into a small glass-topped display case by the wall. The robber's attention, however, wasn't on the stacks of bills. His gaze was fixed on the case, which held a sad collection of unclaimed items, forgotten collateral from broken lives. His gloved hand swept across the contents, a gold watch, a pair of cufflinks, a signet ring, before it stopped. He pointed a single determined finger. That. Charlie, trembling, looked at the object. It was a small silver locket tarnished with age, its surface etched with a delicate pattern of intertwined vines. It was a simple, almost worthless piece. "The locket," Charlie stammered. The robber's patience snapped. He backhanded the glass, shattering it. Shards rained down onto the floor. He reached in his fingers, closing around the locket with a strange reverence, and snatched it from its velvet bed. And in that moment, Jasper's world tilted on its axis. The noise of the bank, the fear, the dust, it all faded into a deafening roar in his ears. That was not just any locket. The afternoon sun, streaming through the grimy bank window, had caught the silver in a way he remembered, a way that sent an agonizing spear of memory straight through his heart. He could see it resting in the hollow of his wife's throat. He could feel the cool metal of it in his own hand and the familiar weight of the tiny hinge. It was Sarah's. His Sarah. Gone 2 years now, but the pain of her absence was as sharp and immediate as the shattered glass on the floor. The robber pocketed the locket, scooped a few stacks of bills into a canvas sack almost as an afterthought, and vaulted back over the counter. He moved toward the door, his steps measured and confident. As he passed Jasper, his cold blue eyes met Jasper's for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition, only a chilling, dismissive emptiness. Then he was gone, swallowed by the unforgiving sun, leaving behind a wake of terror and one man's shattered past. Jasper remained on his knees, oblivious to the rising tide of shouts and sobs around him. The robbery, the money, the danger, none of it mattered. A man had walked into the Millfield Bank and stolen the last tangible piece of his soul. The question that burned in his mind was not how, but why. Who was this man, and why in a vault full of gold and silver had he come for nothing but a memory? The ride back to the ranch was a blur of shimmering heat and suffocating dust. The arid landscape, once a place of promise, now felt like a prison of his own making. The heat warped the horizon, making the distant mesas tremble as if in a fever dream. Coarse red sand picked up by a malevolent wind stung his eyes and caked his lips. Each mile he traveled away from town was a mile deeper into the isolation that had defined his life since Sarah's passing. His cabin stood like a lonely sentinel in a sea of brown, its timbers bleached gray by the relentless sun. The corral, which had once held a dozen spirited horses, was now home to only one. He swung down from the saddle, his movements stiff, with a sorrow that went deeper than muscle. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of the porch swing, moving in the hot breeze, an empty rhythmic ghost of the evenings he and Sarah had spent there. Inside the cabin was a monument to a life suspended in time. Sarah's shawl was still draped over the back of her rocking chair. A half-finished piece of needlepoint lay in her sewing basket, the needle still threaded. Jasper lived around these relics, careful not to disturb them, as if preserving the scene would somehow preserve the life that had filled it. But the bank robbery had desecrated this fragile sanctuary. The memory of the locket stolen and defiled felt like a violation of the highest order. He sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the foreclosure notice from the bank lying where he had left it that morning. The paper felt brittle, its formal, unpitying words a death sentence for the life he had built. He had poured 15 years of sweat and blood into this land. He and Sarah had arrived with nothing but a wagon, 2 strong horses, and a belief that hard work could carve a paradise out of this wilderness. For a time it had been. They'd built the cabin with their own hands, raised a small herd, and watched the sun rise and set on their own piece of the world. Then the drought came, a slow, merciless killer that baked the earth and withered the grass. Disease followed, taking his cattle one by one. The debts piled up like tombstones, each one marking another dream buried. And then the fever had come for Sarah. A wave of guilt, his constant companion, washed over him. He closed his eyes, and a memory sharp and vivid rose to torment him. We should move closer to town. Sarah's voice was gentle, but her eyes held a flicker of worry. They were sitting on the porch with the locket gleaming at her throat. Just for a while. Dr. Miller said the fever is spreading. If one of us got sick. This is our home, Sarah. He had answered, his voice stubborn, full of the pride that he now recognized as a fatal flaw. We built it. We don't run from a little trouble. The land will provide. It always has. It's not the land I'm worried about, she had murmured, her hand closing over the locket. Some things are more important than a piece of dirt. He had been wrong. The land had not provided. When the fever took hold of her, they were 2 days' hard ride from Dr. Miller. By the time he'd gotten her to town, it was too late. Her last whispered words had been his name. He had brought her back here to be buried on the small hill overlooking the valley she had loved, the locket clutched in her hand, until the very end. He had placed it in the bank for safekeeping, unable to bear the sight of it, yet unwilling to part with it forever. Now a stranger possessed it, a stranger with cold, intelligent eyes. His gaze fell on Thunder, his last horse grazing peacefully in the corral. The chestnut stallion was a magnificent animal, strong and loyal, the final living link to the good years. The foreclosure notice demanded payment in full. The only asset he had left was Thunder. The thought of selling him felt like a final, absolute betrayal, not just of the horse, but of Sarah's memory. Thunder had been her favorite. But the robbery had changed something. The theft of the locket was a personal attack, an act that had awakened a dormant part of him. He needed answers. To get them, he needed to be free of the chains that bound him to this land. The bank owned his ranch, but it did not own his past. And he would be damned if he let some ghost in a duster steal that from him too. With a heavy heart, he made the decision. Thunder had to be sold. The next morning, Jasper rode into Millfield, the notice of sale for Thunder in his pocket. The town was still buzzing with talk of the robbery. The sheriff, a weary man named Elias Vance, was questioning people in the street, his frustration mounting with every contradictory description of the robber. Jasper tacked his notice to the board outside the general store, the handwritten words feeling like an admission of defeat. Prime stallion for sale. Strong. Reliable. Inquired Jasper Wilde. He spent the day in a haze, the image of the locket burning behind his eyes. He tried to speak to Sheriff Vance to explain the significance of the stolen item. But the lawman was preoccupied with the stolen money and the larger threat of organized outlaws. A locket, Jasper Vance had said, his tone dismissive. Every bank robbery has collateral damage. He probably just grabbed it because it looked shiny. We're looking for a professional outfit, not a sentimental thief. Dejected, Jasper returned to the ranch, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had lost everything, and no one seemed to understand what his true loss even was. The following dawn, as he was sharing his last handful of oats with Thunder, he saw a rider approaching. It was not a potential buyer from town, but an elderly Apache woman on a paint horse. She rode with a quiet dignity, her weathered face a map of seasons and sorrows. Her gray hair was braided with strips of red cloth, and she wore a mix of traditional buckskin and practical worn leather. She stopped at his fence line and dismounted with a grace that defied her age. "I hear you have a horse for sale?" Her voice was low and melodic, carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. Jasper's throat felt tight. "Yes, ma'am, that's him. Thunder." The woman approached the fence, her dark eyes studying not just the horse, but the man. She moved with a purpose, examining Thunder's legs, his teeth, his hooves, with the thoroughness of someone who understood the soul of a horse, not just its mechanics. Thunder, normally skittish with strangers, stood calmly nuzzling her hand. "He is strong," she said, her gaze returning to Jasper. "His spirit is good. How much?" Jasper had rehearsed the number, but the words still felt like ash in his mouth. $300. It was a fraction of Thunder's worth, but it was the exact amount he needed to clear his debt. The woman nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She reached into a small leather pouch at her waist. Jasper's heart pounded with a desperate, pathetic hope. She did not produce a roll of bills or a heavy sack of coin. Instead, she withdrew a single wrinkled dollar bill and held it out to him. "This is what I can offer," she said simply. The air went out of Jasper's lungs. $1. For his last hope, his final treasure, his most loyal companion. A raw, bitter anger surged through him. It was an insult, a mockery of his desperation. He opened his mouth to tell her to get off his land, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't malice or mockery he saw there. It was a deep, profound sadness, a quiet desperation that mirrored his own. "Ma'am, he began, his voice failing him. She raised a hand. "My name is Ayana. I know what this looks like to you. But sometimes value is not measured in money. It is measured in need." He stared at the single dollar and then at her face. The lines around her eyes spoke of a hard life, her calloused hands of tireless work. She was no wealthier than he was. Why, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why do you need him so badly? Ayanna looked toward the distant mountains, their peaks hazy in the morning light. My grandson Koa. He is sick. The medicine man says his spirit is broken, not his body. For many months he has not spoken, has not left his bed. He withers like a plant without water. She paused, her hand resting on the fence post. He asks for only one thing: to see the horses run free as they did in the old stories his grandfather told him. Our own horses were taken by the harsh winter. This dollar is all I have. Jasper felt something shift deep inside him, a tectonic plate of grief and self-pity giving way. He had been so consumed by his own loss, he had forgotten that the world was filled with other sorrows, some even deeper than his own. The poverty of hope. If I give you Thunder, he asked slowly, what will you do with him? Koa will ride him. Ayanna said, a flicker of light in her dark eyes. They will ride until the boy's spirit remembers how to run with the wind. He will not be a possession. He will be medicine. The rationale part of his mind screamed. A dollar would not save his ranch. It would not pay his debts. It would not bring Sarah back. But as he looked at Ayanna, at the quiet, unshakable faith in her expression, he understood. This was not a transaction of money. It was a transaction of faith. He unlatched the corral gate and led Thunder out, placing the soft leather of the reins into Ayanna's outstretched hand. Take him, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ayanna accepted the reins with the reverence of a sacred trust. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. You are a good man, Jasper Wild. You have chosen a path of the spirit, not the purse. Such paths are hard, but they do not lead to empty places. As she led Thunder away, the stallion turned and looked back at Jasper one last time. There was no betrayal in his eyes, only a quiet understanding. Jasper stood alone in his empty corral and the single-dollar bill clutched in his hand. He had just sealed his own ruin. Yet for the first time in 2 years, he felt a strange, inexplicable lightness, as if by letting go of his last possession, he had untethered himself from the anchor of his own despair. Within hours, Millfield was buzzing with a new story. The tale of the bank robbery was eclipsed by the far more scandalous news of Jasper Wild's folly. When he walked into the general store to buy a small sack of flour with his last few coins, the whispers followed him like flies. Sold that magnificent horse for a single dollar, he heard someone mutter. Grief's finally broken his mind. Martha Henley, the store's owner and the town's primary purveyor of gossip, leaned over the counter. Jasper, is it true, $1? He nodded, not meeting her gaze. But why? She pressed her voice, a mixture of pity and disbelief. That horse was your last chance. It was for a sick child, he said quietly, the words feeling inadequate. Before Martha could respond, a shadow fell across the doorway. Silas Blackwood entered the store, and the atmosphere immediately chilled. He was a new arrival in Millfield, having appeared a few days after the robbery, in a fine carriage pulled by 2 perfectly matched black horses. He dressed in tailored Eastern suits that seemed out of place against the town's dusty backdrop, and he spoke with a cold, eloquent wit that was both charming and unsettling. He had introduced himself as a land investor looking to acquire properties from ranchers hit hard by the drought. Mr. Wild, Silas said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. I was just on my way to your property. I'd hoped to discuss a business proposition. He moved further into the store, his polished boots making no sound on the floorboards. His eyes the same shade of icy blue as the bank robbers settled on Jasper, with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. Jasper's hand instinctively went to his pocket, where the single-dollar bill rested. I'm afraid my property is no longer my own to sell. Jasper set his voice flat. The bank holds the note. An unfortunate but common predicament, Silas said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. Banks, however, can be persuaded. I am in the process of acquiring several such notes in this territory. Consolidating assets, you might say. Your ranch is of particular interest to me. Why, Jasper asked, a knot of suspicion tightening in his gut. Silas smiled, a thin, bloodless motion of his lips. Let's just say I have an appreciation for locations with a certain history. His gaze was sharp, probing, as if he were trying to dissect Jasper's soul. I also heard about your rather unique transaction this morning. A commendable, if financially catastrophic, gesture of charity. It speaks to a certain instability. A man who gives away his fortune for a song is not a man who can be relied upon to manage his affairs. The words were spoken with a veneer of sympathy, but the underlying current was pure acid. Silas was not offering help. He was circling, sensing weakness. That was my business, Jasper said, his voice hardening. Of course, Silas conceded smoothly. He turned to Martha. A word of advice, Mrs. Henley. It is often wise to be cautious in one's dealings with men whose grief has clouded their judgment. Such sentimentality can be contagious and bad for business. He gave Jasper a final lingering look, a look that held a hidden meaning Jasper couldn't yet decipher. And then he was gone, leaving a palpable chill in the warm air of the store. Jasper watched him go, a cold dread creeping up his spine. Silas Blackwood's arrival was too convenient. His interest in the ranch felt too personal. And his eyes. Jasper couldn't shake the feeling he had seen those cold blue eyes before staring at him over the edge of a bandana. Over the next few days, Silas Blackwood's presence in Millfield grew. He spent his time at the saloon buying drinks for the townsfolk and at the bank in long closed-door meetings with Henderson. A subtle poison began to seep into the town's opinion of Jasper. Whispers followed him everywhere, whispers seeded by Silas's eloquent suggestions. He was no longer just a grieving widower. He was unstable, unreliable, a man whose poor decisions were a threat to the community's fragile order. Jasper ignored the talk. His focus was singular, the locket. He began his own quiet investigation, starting with Charlie, the young bank teller. He found the boy sweeping the porch of the bank, still shaken from the ordeal. The robber, Jasper said, keeping his voice low. You saw his hands when he shattered the case. What did you notice? Charlie paused, leaning on his broom. Funny you should ask. They were clean. No calluses, no dirt under the nails. Looked more like a gentleman's hands than an outlaw's. A gentleman's hands, like Silas Blackwood's. The connection was tenuous, a thread of smoke, but it was there. He took his suspicion to Sheriff Vance, who was poring over maps in his office. Silas Blackwood Vance grunted, not looking up. He's a wealthy investor, Jasper. He's buying up half the county. A bit arrogant for my taste, but he's no bank robber. The sheriff finally looked at him, his expression weary. I did find something, though. The robber dropped this on his way out. He pushed a small object across the desk, a spent bullet casing. It was unique, custom-made, with a small stylized B stamped into the base. Never seen one like it, Vance admitted. Probably from some fancy Eastern gunsmith. Jasper studied the casing, memorizing its design, before thanking the sheriff and leaving. Later that day, Vance mentioned offhandedly that the well-dressed Mr. Blackwood had been asking questions around town, not about land, but about Jasper himself. About his debts, his isolation, and the circumstances of his wife's death. While the town grew more suspicious of him, Jasper, standing with the Apache, was quietly transforming. A young brave named Chayton arrived at his ranch one afternoon, leading a pack mule laden with dried meat corn and blankets. From Ayana, Chayton said, his face stoic, but his eyes holding a deep respect. "Koa is getting stronger." He laughs again. "Our people see your heart, Jasper Wild. They will not forget." The gifts were a balm to Jasper's wounded spirit, a reminder that not all of humanity was as cold as Silas Blackwood's eyes. But Silas was not a man to be ignored. His campaign of intimidation escalated. He sent 2 hired men, rough, surly types who looked like they were more comfortable with violence than conversation to Jasper's ranch. They didn't threaten him directly. Instead, they spent an entire afternoon driving survey stakes into his land, measuring fence lines, and speaking loudly about the improvements the new owner was planning. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare designed to break his spirit. Jasper watched them from his porch, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. He was a man with nothing left to lose, which made him both powerless and incredibly dangerous. He knew a confrontation was inevitable. He just didn't know when or what form it would take. The confrontation came sooner than he expected. The next day, Silas's men returned. This time their intentions were not subtle. They began to systematically tear down a section of his corral fence, the one part of the ranch he still meticulously maintained out of love for thunder. "This fence is an eyesore." One of the men sneered when Jasper came out to confront them. "Mr. Blackwood wants the view improved before he takes possession." "Get off my land," Jasper said, his voice dangerously quiet. He held his rifle loosely at his side. The second man laughed. "It ain't your land for much longer, old man. Just saving you the trouble of packing up." He gave a post a hard kick, snapping the weathered wood. Jasper's finger tightened on the trigger. The odds were 2 against 1, but a cold rage was burning away his fear. He had lost his wife, his livelihood, his horse. He would not let these vultures desecrate his home without a fight. Before he could raise the rifle, a sound cut through the tense air, the soft thud of unshod hooves on dry earth. From the cover of the low hills behind the cabin, 3 Apache warriors emerged, materializing from the landscape, as if they were spirits of the land itself. Chayton was at their head, his face a mask of grim determination. They were armed with bows and rifles, and they moved with a silent, coordinated purpose that spoke of a deep-seated warrior tradition. Silas's men froze their bravado, evaporating in the face of this unexpected threat. They had come prepared for a broken rancher, not a disciplined Apache war party. "This does not concern you." The first man stammered, his hand inching toward his pistol. Chayton notched an arrow to his bow, the movement fluid and deadly. "This man is under the protection of our people," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "His land is our concern. Leave now." The 2 thugs exchanged a nervous glance. They were paid to be bullies, not to start a war with the Apache. Cursing under their breath, they scrambled for their horses and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and unfinished destruction. As they fled, one of the men fumbled with his gun belt. Something small and metallic fell to the ground, unnoticed in their haste. Chayton and his warriors dismounted. "Ayana asked us to watch over you," he explained to Jasper. "She said a man with a good heart often attracts men with no heart at all." Jasper could only nod, his gratitude too deep for words. As Chayton spoke, Jasper's eyes caught a glint of brass in the dirt where the men had been standing. He knelt and picked it up. His blood ran cold. It was a bullet casing identical to the one in Sheriff Vance's office. Custom made, with a small stylized B stamped into its base. B for Blackwood. The thread of smoke had become a steel cable. Silas Blackwood, the wealthy investor, was the man who had robbed the bank. He was the man who had stolen Sarah's locket. and for reasons Jasper still couldn't fathom, he wanted to destroy him utterly. Furious at the humiliation of his men, Silas abandoned all pretense of subtlety. He moved with the swift, merciless precision of a striking snake. His first target was the bank. The next morning, a stone-faced Henderson rode out to the ranch flanked by 2 armed deputies. He didn't dismount. "The board met this morning," Jasper Henderson announced, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "At the urging of our new primary investor, Mr. Blackwood, all outstanding high-risk loans are being called in. You have 24 hours to pay your debt in full. Otherwise, we begin foreclosure proceedings at dawn tomorrow." 24 hours. It was an impossible, vindictive deadline. It was not business. It was an execution. As Henderson and his men rode away, another rider approached from the opposite direction. It was one of Silas's men carrying a white flag of truce that seemed like a mockery. He handed Jasper a sealed envelope and retreated without a word. Jasper's hands trembled as he broke the seal. The script inside was elegant, and the letters perfectly formed a stark contrast to the ugliness of the message. "Mr. Wilde, it seems your time on this land is at an end. However, I am a man of compassion. I have heard that the Apache boy Koa has developed a fondness for exploring the old mining trails. He was last seen wandering near the abandoned Widow's Peak mine, a dangerous place for a child. Meet me there at sunset. Bring the signed deed to your ranch. In exchange, I will see to it that the boy is found safely, and I will personally forgive your debt with the bank. Refuse, and I cannot be held responsible for the tragic accidents that so often occur in such unstable terrain. Yours, S. Blackwood." The blood drained from Jasper's face. Silas had kidnapped a child. He was using Koa, the very symbol of Jasper's one selfless act, as a pawn in his cruel game. The choice was clear and monstrous: his home or the life of the boy, who had just rediscovered his own. But as Jasper looked at the letter, he knew this was never about the land. It was a lure, a trap. The Widow's Peak mine was a notoriously unstable relic of a failed silver rush, a place of shadows and collapse. Silas wasn't offering a deal. He was arranging a final fatal confrontation in a place where a man could disappear forever. A sickly, yellow-gray pallor was spreading across the sky as Jasper rode toward Widow's Peak. The wind had picked up, howling through the canyons, with a mournful cry, kicking up dust devils that danced like malevolent spirits. A sandstorm was coming. The air was electric with a tension that mirrored the storm in his own soul. The entrance to the mine was a dark, gaping maw in the side of the mountain, its support timbers groaning under the strain of the shifting earth. Silas stood there, a figure of dark composure against the brewing chaos of nature. He was no longer dressed as an investor. He wore practical dark clothing, a gun belt strapped to his waist. A few feet away, Koa sat on the ground, his hands tied loosely in front of him, his eyes wide with fear. As Jasper dismounted, Silas gave a curt nod. Punctual. "I appreciate that." He walked over to Koa and with a small knife cut the ropes binding the boy's wrists. "Go," he said, his voice flat, his eyes never leaving Jasper. "Run back to your people. Tell them their trust in this man was misplaced." Koa scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the swirling dust, just as the first wave of the sandstorm hit a blinding wall of grit and fury. Now they were alone. "The deed," Jasper Silas said, his voice barely audible over the shriek of the wind. "This was never about the deed," Jasper replied, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "This was about the locket. It was about her. Who are you?" A strange, painful smile twisted Silas's lips. He reached up and pulled a small object from his shirt pocket. It was the silver locket. It swung gently from its chain in his gloved hand. "You really don't remember me, do you?" The grieving husband, so lost in his own righteous sorrow. "I was just a boy when she left with you. A boy who worshipped his older sister." He took a step forward, the wind whipping his coat around him. "My name is Silas. Silas Blackwood is the name I made for myself. But the name I was born with was Silas Bradley. Sarah was my sister." The world stopped. Sarah's brother. He had only met him once, a sullen, angry youth who had disapproved of Sarah marrying a poor rancher and moving west. Jasper's mind reeled, trying to fit the pieces together. "She wrote to me," Silas continued, his voice cracking with a pain that had festered for years. "For the first few years her letters were happy. Then they changed. She wrote about the hardship and the loneliness. She wrote about your pride, your stubborn, damnable pride that kept her chained to this God-forsaken pile of rocks." His composure finally broke his voice, rising to a raw shout against the storm. "The fever came, and you were too proud to leave, too proud to admit you'd failed. You kept her here miles from a doctor until it was too late. Your pride killed her, Jasper. You let her die." He lunged. The fight was not a duel of marksmen. It was a brutal, desperate brawl inside the groaning, creaking entrance of the mine. They crashed against the decaying support beams, their fists finding purchase in a flurry of rage and grief. Dust and sand swirled around them, choking them, blinding them. The mountain groaned in protest, pebbles and dirt raining down from the ceiling. Jasper was stronger, his muscles hardened by years of labor. But Silas fought with the ferocity of a man powered by a decade of hate. He drove Jasper back deeper into the mine's dark throat. A support beam weakened by the strain cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. "She deserved a better life than the one you gave her," Silas roared, landing a blow that sent Jasper staggering. Jasper wiped blood from his lip, his own guilt fueling his anger. "You know nothing about our life. You know nothing about her." He drove Silas back against a rock wall, his hands closing around Silas's throat. For a moment he had him. Vengeance was a heartbeat away. But as he looked into Silas's eyes, Sarah's eyes, he saw not a monster, but a man drowning in the same sea of grief as himself. "She wrote this." Silas choked out his hand, fumbling inside his coat. "In her last days. She gave it to a circuit preacher to mail. Read it. Read how you failed her." He shoved a crumpled, yellowed letter into Jasper's hand. Jasper's grip loosened. With the mine groaning around them, threatening to entomb them both, he unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting was faint, but unmistakably Sarah's. "My dearest Silas, if you are reading this, then my time here is over. Do not be angry with Jasper. Do not let sorrow poison your heart. He begged me to go to town, to leave the ranch, until the sickness passed, but I refused. This land, this life we built, it is our heart, Jasper's and mine. I would rather have one day here with him than a lifetime in a city without him. It was my choice, my love. Forgive him, and live a life worthy of the love I will always have for you." The letter fell from Jasper's fingers. The truth in Sarah's own words was a cataclysm. It shattered Silas's carefully constructed temple of vengeance. It washed away the years of Jasper's own crushing guilt. She had chosen out of love. Silas stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and utter devastation. No. She wouldn't. At that moment, a massive timber overhead splintered with a deafening crack. The entrance to the mine began to collapse. A cascade of rock and earth thundered down, shaking the very foundations of the mountain. Silas, stunned and broken, was knocked from his feet, his leg pinned beneath a heavy fallen beam. The path to the outside was closing fast. Jasper could make it. He could leave Silas to be buried alive, a fitting end for the man who had tried to destroy him. Revenge was his for the taking. He looked at Silas, trapped and helpless, his face pale with terror. He saw the angry boy he had met years ago. He saw Sarah's brother, and he saw a reflection of his own pain. With a cry that was part exertion and part roar of defiance against the fates that had brought them to this place, Jasper turned back. He grabbed a smaller discarded timber, and with all the strength left in his body, he jammed it under the beam, pinning Silas's leg, using it as a lever. The muscles in his back and arms screamed in protest. Dust filled his lungs. The world was ending around him. "Push," he yelled. He gave one final desperate heave. The beam lifted just enough for Silas to pull his mangled leg free. Jasper grabbed him, hauling him toward the rapidly shrinking patch of light. They stumbled out into the dying fury of the sandstorm, just as the entire mine entrance collapsed behind them, with a final earth-shattering roar, sealing the darkness forever. The world outside the mine was scoured and new. The sandstorm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible clarity and an eerie, profound silence. Jasper lay on the ground, his lungs burning his body, a collection of aches and bruises. Beside him, Silas was curled in on himself, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with ragged, silent sobs. From the rocks above, figures emerged. It was Chayton, and behind him, Koa, safe and sound. They were not alone. Several other Apache warriors were with them, their faces grim. They had followed, had waited out the storm bearing witness. The journey back to Millfield was a slow, somber procession. Chayton's warriors fashioned a crude travois for Silas, whose leg was badly broken. Jasper walked beside it, leading his horse, his mind a quiet, empty space, where guilt and anger had once raged. As they neared the town, they saw a gathering in the main street. It was not a lynch mob, nor was it a welcoming party. It was a delegation. Chief Running Bear, the respected elder of the regional tribes, stood waiting Ayana at his side. They had come not as saviors, but as a community offering its silent, unshakable support. Sheriff Vance met them, his face a mixture of confusion and relief. Jasper explained everything, his voice low and steady. Silas, his face pale and streaked with tears and dirt, did not deny a word. He confessed to the robbery, to the kidnapping, his voice hollow with the emptiness of a man whose life's purpose had just been proven a lie. The locket was recovered from his pocket and handed back to Jasper, its silver surface cool and heavy in his palm. As the sheriff led Silas to the town's small jail, Ayana approached Jasper. She held out a heavy leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coin. "Our people have gathered this," she said, her voice soft. "Koa told us what the man in the mine said, that he would take your land. This is not a gift. It is a balancing of debts. You saved our child's spirit. We will not let you lose your home." Jasper looked at the pouch, then at the faces of the Apache families who had gathered. He saw no pity in their eyes, only a profound, quiet respect. He accepted the pouch, the weight of it, both a burden and a blessing. It was enough to pay the bank to settle his affairs. It was a new beginning, offered by the very people the world had taught him to mistrust. Weeks passed. The dust settled over Millfield. Silas Blackwood, his leg healing in a cast, awaited the arrival of a federal judge. The story of his vendetta, of Sarah's letter, and of Jasper's choice in the collapsing mine had become a local legend, a cautionary tale of how grief could curdle into poison. Jasper used the money from the Apache families to pay his debt to the bank in full. Henderson, humbled and ashamed, could barely meet his eyes. But freedom from debt did not bring Jasper the peace he sought. The ranch, once a sanctuary of love, had become a tomb of memories, a monument to a pride that had almost cost him everything. He no longer felt bound to it by love, only by the ghost of guilt, and that ghost had now been laid to rest. He sold the ranch, not out of defeat but out of choice. He sold it to a young family just starting out, their eyes bright with the same hope he and Sarah had once shared. He watched them move in, heard the sound of children's laughter, where there had only been silence, and felt a sense of closure, of a cycle being completed. On his last day in the territory, he rode out to the small hill overlooking the valley. The afternoon was clear and quiet, the air sweet with the scent of sage. He knelt at Sarah's grave, the simple wooden cross he had carved for her, now weathered by 2 years of sun and wind. He had taken the locket to the town's blacksmith, who had carefully smoothed out the dents and mended the broken chain. He held it in his palm, the silver warm from the sun. He opened the tiny clasp. Inside were the 2 miniature portraits, his own young and full of foolish confidence, and hers, her smile radiating a love so powerful it had reached across death to save him. He didn't say any words. None were needed. With a gentle hand, he hung the locket over the top of the wooden cross, letting it rest against the weathered grain. It was an act of letting go not of her memory, but of the pain that had bound him to it. He was finally free, finally. As he mounted his new horse, a spirited gray gelding, a gift from Chayton, he saw Ayanna waiting for him at the bottom of the hill. "Your path takes you from this valley," she said, her eyes wise. "I don't know where I'm going," Jasper admitted, the uncertainty feeling less like fear and more like possibility. "It does not matter," Ayanna replied. "A man who carries peace in his heart is always home. But know this, you will always have a home among our people. Not as a hero, Jasper Wilde, but as a brother." He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and for the first time since Sarah's death, a genuine smile touched his lips. He nodded his thanks, a promise passing between them without words. He turned his horse not toward the east or the west, but simply away toward a horizon that was no longer an ending, but a new, uncertain, and hopeful beginning.